Placing his hands on the table, Balasan began to stare intently at Vikir and called his attention. Our boy who was sitting in front remained silent. The attention of all the students focused on them, and their eyes widened with fear, realizing that there was going to be a fight. With a furious gaze, Balasan clenched his teeth and asked if Vikir was the strongest first-year student at Kalyasio Academy. Instead of panicking, our boy stayed calm and began to ponder silently. Not long after, Balasan forcefully placed his elbow on the table. He sat across from Vikir, and while his eyes were shining with hatred, suggested an arm wrestling match without mana to see how strong Vikir really was. With a lost expression, Vikir began to gaze at the ground in silence and did not say a single word. Balasan's eyes began to shine, and an arrogant smile appeared on his face upon seeing Vikir's attitude. He mocked our boy by asking if perhaps he was feeling afraid, and if so, he could admit it without problem. He would be quite impressed with the level of Kalyasio Academy if someone like him was considered the strongest. Upon hearing this, the eyes of Bianca, Piggy, Sinclair and Tudor filled with rage. They began to stare at Balasan and couldn't help but feel furious. Just then, someone decided to put an end to this. It was Dolores, with an angry expression. She placed her hands on top of the table, started staring intently at Balasan and made it clear that she wasn't going to allow conflicts between academies before the tournament. The attention of our boy fixed on her. He was somewhat confused. Everyone noticed that she was Dolores Lankovadis, the president of the student council of the Coliseum Academy. Balasan began to gaze toward the table in silence. With a serious expression, Dolores asked them to stop playing children's games and suggested going to bed early for the tournament. At that moment, a muscular man began walking toward them and caught their attention. He placed his hand on Balasan's shoulder and seeing that the energetic young people had a small conflict, he asked Dolores if she didn't think it was going to be fun. Feeling this, Balasan turned his head and his eyes widened with confusion and surprise. With eyes shining with excitement, a red-haired man began to show a smile. He was Bakira. Dolores' attention was fixed on him and her eyes widened in surprise and astonishment. She didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, on the other side, Vikir, who was sitting next to her, remained calm. He was Geragio Bakira. Seeing that even the president of the student council of Boot Camp Varangia had come, people became confused. Bakira placed his hands on his waist, began to observe her with a serene gaze and mentioned that Balasan had put at stake his own name and the honor of the first-year students of Boot Camp Varangia by proposing a duel. He asked Vikir for his opinion, reminding him that he was considered the strongest man among the first years at the academy. His eyes began to shine with joy and an excited smile appeared on his face. He wanted Vikir to accept. Vikir remained silent, not knowing what to say. Dolores began staring intently at Bakira and mentioned that she understood what he meant, but if it couldn't be done, it couldn't be done. While Bakira's eyes were shining with joy, he placed his hand on Balasan's shoulder and with a smile began to point to the side with his finger, revealing that Balasan was desperate to show his strength and also asked them to look. With a gaze full of determination, Balasan began to snort smoke from his nose, desperate to arm wrestle Vikir. Not far away were Bianca, Sancho, Tudor, Piggy and Sinclair. Their eyes were shining with rage. They could endure being insulted, but they would not allow anyone to insult their friends. Bakira revealed that they too were desperate for Vikir to show his strength. They clenched their fists and began staring at Balasan with a piercing gaze. The Loris' attention was fixed on them, and her eyes filled with concern. With a nervous expression, she began to ponder in silence, knowing that if she used her authority to force them to withdraw authoritatively, it could affect the morale of the first-year students before the tournament. Nevertheless, the safety of the students was her priority. Vicar began to observe her attentively with a curious gaze. He did not know what she had in mind. Then, he raised his head, and while his eyes were shining, he began to stare at Balasan in silence. Bakira put his arm around Balasan's neck and with a smile thought that Vicar was afraid of being hurt. He promised that the gain would be done with moderation. Upon hearing this, Balasan's eyes filled with fear and confusion. Vicar began to imagine Bakira from the past, remembering that Geragio Bakira, before his regression, had been one of the great heroes of humanity's united forces. During his time at boot camp Varangia, because his grandparents were originally from Suhi, he had suffered discrimination. But despite this, he fought against fourth-year students and became a legend for having dominated the academy. In the confrontations with the Varangia boot camp, led by Bakira and with strong cohesion, he learned not to be underestimated and to earn respect. The Loris moved away from the table and began to observe Vicar in silence. Bakira, who was standing next to Balasan, remained silent, waiting for Vicar's response. Vicar began to gaze at the ground and agreed to have an arm wrestling match with Balasan. Upon hearing this, Bakira closed his eyes and couldn't help but laugh. He was so excited that he started choking Balasan, who began screaming for help. With a worried gaze, the Loris asked if Vicar was sure about this. Our boy stood up and began to ponder. Although he was going to draw some attention, if he obsessed over trivial things, he would lose the essence. He began to gaze at the ground, then started pointing at Bakira with his finger and said that he wanted to have an arm wrestling match with Bakira instead of Balasan. Upon hearing this, their eyes filled with confusion and surprise. No one knew what was happening. Balasan's eyes filled with rage. The jaws of all the students, including the Loris, dropped in surprise. They couldn't believe that Vicar wanted to have an arm wrestling match with Bakira. With eyes shining with fury, Balasan clenched his fist and made it clear that he was Vicar's opponent. Just then, Bakira put his hand forward and an excited smile spread across his face. Seeing this, Balasan felt confused and his eyes filled with fear. He didn't know what he had in mind. Vicar began to show a determined expression, and noticing this, Bakira realized that he wasn't joking. With eyes shining with excitement, Bakira rested his elbow on the table, and while his body was releasing an immense amount of mana, with a smile he decided to accept having an arm wrestle with Vicar. Our boy also rested his elbow on the table and grabbed Bakira's hand, both prepared for an arm wrestle. The Loris stood next to the table, and with a serious expression she said that the rules were simple. The result of the arm wrestle would be decided by a clear victory, defeat or surrender, with an expression full of determination. Vicar prepared to defeat Bakira. The Loris' attention was fixed on him. With a gaze full of concern, she revealed that she would stop the duel if she noticed any risk of injury. Both grabbed each other's hands tightly, and the Loris asked them to get ready. At that moment, our boy began to apply some force, and upon noticing this, Bakira's eyes filled with surprise. He didn't know what was happening. An excited smile appeared on our boy's face. The Loris gave the signal for the duel to begin, and both started applying force. Not long after, Bakira began to gain the advantage, but our boy focused since he wasn't going to lose this arm wrestling match. All the students felt excited and began cheering. One of Balasan's friends put his hand under his chin and felt confused. He thought that Vikar would lose as soon as they started, but he wondered how, with that body, he could withstand Bakira's strength. The other man's eyes filled with surprise. According to him, this was not possible. He assumed that Bakira was not using all his strength because he was afraid of breaking Vikar's arm. With eyes shining with seriousness, Balasan clenched his fist and began shouting, asking Bakira not to hold back. Piggy put his hands on top of his head and felt worried for Vikar. Sinclair's eyes filled with worry and surprise. She didn't know what was happening. Tudor's eyes widened in surprise. He had felt that Vikar was strong, even in the match against Neftali, but he did not expect that he could stand up to Bakira. Sancho was in shock as he couldn't believe how strong Vikar was. With a curious gaze, Tudor began to observe closely and mentioned that if Bakira was doing this seriously, they could really expect Vikar's victory. The arm wrestling match was intense. Bakira clenched his teeth tightly and decided not to lose against our boy. Dollars began to watch attentively. Bakira's hands started trembling and he clenched his teeth tightly. He couldn't believe that Vikar was so strong. His eyes widened in confusion. He had been thinking of ending this arm wrestling properly by controlling his strength, but at the moment when he had taken his hand, his thoughts had changed. He began to imagine Vikar's muscles surrounded by mana. He thought about how the load weighed through the triceps and shoulders, and the shape of the hand was designed to maximize the strength of the forearm muscles. He realized that, although he himself was ahead in the weight category, Vikar's technique was on a completely different level. He began to imagine himself dragging a mountain. He felt that, setting aside technique, it was like a rocky mountain, like trying to forcefully pull an enormous rocky mountain. With his face full of sweat and a smile, he mentioned that the way Vikar used his power seemed to him like that of a veteran who had been through everything. He found him as experienced as his own father and wondered how it was possible. He felt curious to know who Vikar really was. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. Vikar began to speak in the language of Bakira, revealing that he was the hunting ground. Upon hearing this, Bakira's eyes filled with fear and surprise. With shining eyes, Vikar began to stare at Bakira, revealing that he was the hunting ground of Balak. Vikar decided to stop playing and began to use all his strength, slamming Bakira's hand against the table. His strength was so immense that smoke began to emerge. Seeing this, Bakira clenched his teeth tightly. Dolores put her hands over her face. She didn't know what was happening. Everyone else's eyes filled with confusion. No one could see ahead since a dust storm had suddenly appeared. Once the curtain of dust disappeared, the broken table could be seen and Vikar lying on the ground in Bakira's standing. No one knew who had won. With a confused gaze, Bakira began to look at his hand just before he could admit defeat. Vikar, who was sitting on the ground with a serious gaze, admitted that he had lost. Everyone started cheering for Vikar for having fought well and for having endured so long against someone as strong as Bakira. Bakira clenched his fist tightly, knowing that Vikar had let him win. He began to walk toward our boy. Vikar's attention focused on him, and his eyes began to shine. They both shook hands and, speaking in the language of the tribe, Bakira admitted that Vikar was the pride of the deep forests. His eyes began to shine with joy and he swore never to forget Vikar. He grabbed Vikar's arm and raised it in the air. With a smile, Bakira mentioned that Vikar had incredible strength for having been able to withstand his power. Our boy remained silent. Sancho's eyes began to shine with joy, and a smile spread across his face, realizing that this was a friendship between men. Tudor crossed his arms and couldn't help but smile, since according to him Bakira was great, he was a real man. Piggy clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with excitement. His heart was racing at full speed. He really wanted the day of the tournament to arrive. It was night, and with the burning passion of men, the first day before the competition was slowly coming to an end amid intense heat. And finally, the true day of the University League arrived. Inside the tower was the management office of the Magic Tower, the master of the Magic Tower. Blue Whale began stroking his beard and mentioned that it was an honor for him to have them in the tower for this year's competition. In front of him was a woman with brown hair. She was the Masira's director named Hippolyte, and a man with a scar on his face. He was general of boot camp Varangia named Basilios. Also present was Banshee Mork, deputy director of Colosseum Academy. They were all seated around a hologram. Blue Whale thanked everyone for having made their way to the Magic Tower and expressed his gratitude. Hippolyte began to point at the hologram with her finger and mentioned that the extra eye of the Magic Tower was always amazing. Basilios couldn't help but smile since he could see all the students who were inside. With a smile, Blue Whale said it was true. You could see what the 400 students were doing. In the hologram, red dots could be seen. This year's survival competition map was the enemy and the Black Mountain. Everyone began to watch closely, and somewhere was Vikir, and behind him there were monsters staring at him. Blue Whale asked if they didn't feel great curiosity about how the students would survive in this infernal map. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,